My name is John Mirsky. I'm a board member of the nonprofit A2 Modern. It is a volunteer-run organization. We are probably best known for various events, including open houses, as well as for our website, which is listed here in the lower right. On our website, we have a list of characteristics of mid-century modern design that distinguish that period in design and architecture in particular from previous styles. We have a total of about 250 listings of mid-century architecture here in the Ann Arbor area. There are approximately 35 architects that designed those, and we have bios on almost all of those on our website. In addition, we have an interactive map that allows you to see where they all are, and if you just hover over the pins, you can find out where they are, see a small thumbnail of the structure. We have also a lot of research articles, and then we have an archive of all of the announcements of the events like this one that we've hosted over the last 10 or more years. Finally, we have a new feature. We have a for sale webpage where people who are selling mid-century structures here in Ann Arbor or nearby or designed by one of our architects, where those can be listed. And the current page features a cottage designed by Robert Metcalf that is on Crystal Lake up north near Frankfort, Michigan. That is for sale, so if you're in the market, check that out. So today, we're happy to host this event where Peter Osler is our speaker. I won't talk about the subject, he will, but I'll introduce Peter. Peter was born into a family with farmers on one side. You can see the pictures there, so that's reflected in his heritage a little bit, and architects on the other. His sister, Molly, was an A2 board member for many years until her passing in 2019. Peter has spent his adult life as what he calls a spatial practitioner and part-time academician. He has lived in Ann Arbor, his birthplace, as well as that of his parents for 2/3 of his life, but also enjoyed stops in Bloomington, Indiana, Cambridge and Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, Champaign-Urbana, and Rome, Italy. He has taught at the University of Michigan, where he received his BS in Natural Resources, and where he was also an associate professor of practice at the Taubman College. Also at the University of Illinois, the Escola Técnica Superior de Arquitectura in Barcelona. I don't speak Spanish, so forgive me. And the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he received his professional training in both landscape architecture and architecture. The Illinois Institute of Technology, where he directed the Master of Landscape Architecture program for its first 7 years, and most recently at Washington University, St. Louis. Peter's academic interests are focused on modernist site planning and landscape materiality, especially plants as historical and cultural ciphers, their potential as contemporary art medium, and their maintenance as an untapped source of poetics, a subject about which he has lectured widely. Professionally, he has worked in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design practices, large and small, and as campus landscape architect and planner at the Cranbrook Educational Community. He works at a wide landscape of landscape types and scales, both as a sole practitioner and in collaboration with larger firms. Recently completed projects range in scale from the outdoor spaces of Titletown in Green Bay, Wisconsin, which won the Merit Award from the state ASLA chapters of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Colorado, all the way to sculptural stainless steel furniture for the Knight Wallace Journalism Fellowship Program here at the University of Michigan. His designs have been published in the United States, Europe, and Asia, and he has been an invited juror at universities throughout the United States and Europe. Having won the Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture, he is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. And lastly, I might add that a while back, Peter was a damn good tennis player in his youth. I know that because we played tennis on the Huron High School team where he was first singles and I was third doubles. so welcome and thank you very much, Peter. We're looking forward to it.
Thanks, John. Thanks to all of you for coming. I'm going to start by just, as John mentioned, my sister Molly, who was a wonderful person and a modernist through and through. And I'm sorry she's not here to hear this, although it's good that she's not here, I don't know. But in any case, depending how good a lecture it is. But in any case, Molly talked to me about giving a talk about landscape many years ago, before COVID, and never got around to really happening until further nudging by John. And it's nice to be here to talk about a subject matter that I think probably most of you don't know a lot about. I'm sure many of you garden or work on your home landscapes, but in terms of what landscape architecture is, hopefully today's talk will be an introduction perhaps, or enlightening. Now, I'm here talking to a lot of people from A2 Modern. So, this quote by Thomas Wolfe, "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain. Has there ever been another place on earth where so many people of wealth and power have paid for and put up with so much architecture they detested as within thy blessed borders?" I doubt it, seriously. So this is from his screed on modernism, Bauhaus to our house, in the 80s, and I have to be happy that I don't think it's lived on to be a noteworthy book, but it's too facile. But in any case, I do think modernism, certainly like any other type of architecture, has its faults, and but I think that modernism is misunderstood, and it's a kind of an easy thing to poke at, but the more you know about it, the more nuance that you can unearth in it, I think then you start to realize its long-lasting value. And so I'm going to show you a lot of slides today, so put on your seatbelts, and I'm going to be discussing Kiley as I think he, in some way, that I think he needs to be introduced in that sense that he's not your quintessential kind of linear, he doesn't have a linear kind of bio. He wasn't really a scholar. There are a lot of enigmatic aspects to his work. So, perhaps that'll elicit some questions at the end of today's talk. Some of the things that I say might sound somewhat contradictory, but that's the way he was. The project, as I think most of you know, is about the Miller House. It should have said the Miller Garden and House. Usually it's always referred to as the house and garden, but today I really want to put the emphasis on the landscape itself. So, but the players, one of the things that's interesting about the project is that I think, there are architects, landscape architects who think of themselves as kind of people that need to work in isolation, but I think that this project is really noteworthy for a collaboration between multiple disciplines, and this is just a brief, an introduction to the kind of prominence of some of the people that were involved. J. Irwin Miller, an industrialist of great note. Not too many people end up on the cover of Esquire magazine, but I suppose from that you can imagine what his leanings may have been. I mean, he was a church-going Midwesterner, grew up in Columbus, Indiana. I think Midwestern through and through. but had a really interesting background that we'll get into in a bit. Eero Saarinen, hopefully most of you know who Eero Saarinen is, someone who grew up, spent a lot of time in Birmingham, in Bloomfield Hills at Cranbrook. Jeffrey Welch, who's in the audience, makes me a little nervous, is a scholar who's written about Eero Saarinen, beautifully written thoughts on him and his work, and then Daniel Urban Kiley. And there are some others, Alexander Girard, who you might know of, who did the interiors for the house, but also was involved in some of the hardware outside the house, the gates. There are a couple of gates that I don't have pictures of, but gates on the site, and has a really wonderful influence on the project. You'll see that his work is really wonderfully complementary, juxtaposed to the kind of tightness of the architecture, and I think that what most people would think of as being a kind of a tight landscape as well. And then it should be noted also that Kevin Roche, who's there on the right, Eero Saarinen on the left, and this was taken in 1957. So this was around the time of the completion of the Miller House. Roche was one of the staff members of the Saarinen firm, and the Saarinen firm had an amazing array of people who went through the office: Robert Venturi, Caesar Pelli, Chuck Bassett, a lot of very, 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 very well-known architects who went on to have great careers. And Kevin Roche was part of Roche and Dinkeloo. You might know that firm. Dinkeloo was a graduate of the University of Michigan, but they did work all over the world, and Kevin Roche just recently died. Kevin was really the person he was the project architect on this project, and the story goes that when this project first started in the early 50s, it was around the time that Saarinen's office had a lot of work, including GM Tech, and GM Tech was, as you can imagine, a major project in comparison to a house. So Kevin Roche, the people who've done research on this project, have told me that Roche was really, really instrumental in the project and really the leader of the project. I don't know why I'm getting this strange spacing. Okay. Should go there automatically, I would think, but anyways. Okay, so Dan Kiley, this is in comparison to the first image, if you remember, with his hair tousled. That was kind of, Dan lived and worked for most of his career in Charlotte, Vermont, on the shores of Lake Champlain, in a very natural landscape. You know, most landscape architects and architects live in cities, right? They want to be around where the work is and be in kind of an urbane environment. Well, Dan was completely different. He actually wanted to be living in nature, kind of surrounded by nature. And it's so amazing because he was going off all around the world doing these projects for all kinds of super wealthy people and big, you know, industrial projects, big government projects. And yet he was always coming back, always returning to these kind of more wild roots. And so this would be an image that, you know, is the other side of Dan, the one that could put on a tie and wear a khaki suit at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, project by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. And you should note here that this is attributed to Aaron Kiley, who was one of his sons. He had 8 children. All stories about the Kiley family are really interesting. They led a really kind of crazy life. Somebody just recently told me the kids had no toys. He would do things like just give them string, and they would have to figure out things to do with string, which sounds pretty great, right? Anyways, Aaron was a very successful photographer. He lived in Ann Arbor for many years. I actually gave him tennis lessons. And his son, Oliver, is a very successful landscape architect in Ann Arbor, works for the Smith Group. So some background on Kiley. He was born in Boston in the Roxbury area. He was very, very upfront about how he grew up in a poor family, what he considered poor, which he said was for him a great thing. It allowed him to kind of live with fewer rules, and he could be outside all the time playing in the city. And he thinks that really made him look at the world in a very different way, and with a certain urgency that perhaps others wouldn't with a more privileged upbringing. When he was growing up, one of the things he did was he caddied on golf courses, and that was very influential to him. He said it was the first time he had actually experienced a landscape that he considered it was a kind of a naturalized landscape, but in fact that the grading of it and the planting of vegetation and so forth had some kind of legible intent to it, and that made a great impression on him. He also spent time at another grandparent's farm outside of Boston, I think. He apprenticed with a very significant person in the field, Warren Manning, who I mentioned here was Frederick Law Olmsted's plantsman. So he was the person in the Olmsted office who was seen as being the most knowledgeable person about plants, which is somewhat ironic about what happened with the Miller House, which I'll touch on. He went to Manning's office, started working for free, and then worked for him while he was supposedly 30 hours a week while he was at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He went there as a special student. He had never gone to undergraduate school. And he left after 2 years without a degree. He didn't really see much value in Harvard. I guess the story goes that he said that music appreciation was the one class that he thought was really of benefit. And I did a little research trying to find what the music appreciation classes, the syllabus would have been in a course like that. Because you'll see I'm kind of speculating about, in the upcoming slides, speculating about possible influences on Kiley's attitude and his work. Maybe they're somewhat of a stretch, but I think they have a certain logic. But in any case, music appreciation, and he actually was planning on going back to work for Manning afterwards, but Manning died in 1938, I think it was, right as he was finishing. So the office closed, and he then went on to work. He went to he worked in the housing department in D.C., where he crossed paths with Louis Kahn, if you know Lou Kahn, the very famous 20th century architect. And he also, he had a serendipitous crossings of paths with Eero Saarinen, while his father, Eliel, who designed most of Cranbrook, was the architect for the first Christian church in downtown Columbus, which is a really wonderful church, wonderful building. And I guess the story goes that while Eliel was meeting with the building committee, sometimes he'd bring Eero with him, and Eero, his son, and Jaron Miller would go out for walks and talk about architecture and other things. And so that's how their relationship was forged. Well, it is very notable that when Kiley was at Harvard, he crossed paths with Garrett Eckbo and James Rose. And the three of them were kind of the triumvirate of early modern landscape architecture, and they had different approaches. They had very different careers. Eckbo ended up he wrote some very influential books. He ended up starting a firm that grew to be gigantic and that still is going through a different name. James Rose was a bit more idiosyncratic. He worked out of New Jersey, and his residence and office you can visit that. I've never been there, but the pictures look amazing, and he was a really amazing author. He had wrote a book called Gardens Make Me Laugh. Anyways, he was kind of a character. So when they were at Harvard, they actually, while they were in school, they wrote a series of articles for Architectural Record magazine that was kind of a manifesto for new landscape architecture. And there were 3 articles. One was on urbanism, one was on the garden, and one was on housing. And those writings had a great deal of influence on the profession. He had a wife for 61 years. Again, I mentioned they had 8 children. She was known to be his muse. She was a poet and a writer and read vociferously, I guess, voraciously, I should say. And that most of his life and professional life he was living in Vermont, kind of rural Vermont. So another connection that I made and I'd never really thought about it before, but in putting this talk together is that in Kylie being there from 36 to 38, there was a very, very notable book produced. It was published in 1941, and it was the result of the outgrowth of a series of lectures that Harvard has every year, and they still have them. It's called the Charles Eliot Norton lectures, and Laurie Anderson gave them, I think, last year, and a lot of very famous people gave them the year after Gideon's lectures in 1938. You give them across the course of the academic year, so 38, 39, was Igor Stravinsky, and that grew into a book called The Poetics of Music. So Kylie was around during this time, and architecture was in this spirit. It was the architecture department at Harvard was very forward-looking. Walter Gropius was running the department, and this idea of space, time, and architecture was a very new way of thinking about architecture. This idea of like movement through architecture, not thinking of it as an object, a static object, but thinking as much or more about how one moves through it, how time and movement are an essential part of architecture. And also just even to the scale of cities and the advent of the interstate system and the cars and so forth. That was of great influence. And one of the interesting things about the book, it was a new way of, in terms of architectural treatises, whatever, was this idea of these fold-outs where you had these juxtapositions of architecture. And this is a Gropius building, the Bauhaus building in Dessau, and a Picasso painting. And so there was this approach to architecture, which wasn't as much as they were forward-thinking. They were also still thinking very much about the past, about history, about precedents, and precedents not only within the discipline, but outside the discipline. So arts, music, literature. So I'm going to kind of try to get into that a bit. So in literature, Wallace Stevens, if you know his work, is an early mid-20th century poet, and he's architects are big fans of Wallace Stevens, and the most often cited poems that he wrote. The first one is the anecdote of the jar, and this idea of placing something as small as a jar on a hill, and how that changes the environment just inherently around it. You start to look at things in relationship to that jar. This quote down here by John Dixon Hunt, who was a very, very prominent landscape historian. The introduction of a work of art into the unmediated wilderness of nature alters both, although it's wilderness that seems more changed. Gardens, too, are jars, set down in otherwise untouched landscape, and part of their function and interest is that they alter the surroundings by their presence. So that's something to think of in looking at the Miller Garden. The other poem is The Snowman. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's this really amazing line that I think is very profound here. This idea of nothing that is not there and nothing that is. So ponder that. And so again, this is a lot of what the Gideon was about and what was being talked about. Again, not only in architecture, but in sculpture at the time and in painting. This idea of kind of emptiness, and what is the character, quality of emptiness? Does it have a quality? Can you give it? Can it have a quality, right? And this is something that really traditional architecture hadn't really addressed. It seems so obvious, but in any case, this is another very important line to think of, because there's a lot of empty space in the Miller Garden. And one of the issues would be whether or not that seems to make the scheme kind of flaccid and boring or whatever, or or is it in fact, can it in fact make it charge, and how do you charge it? And I think Kylie in this project really is the kind of apex of charging what one might think of as, or maybe could be described as, empty space, but in fact there is something there in that nothing. So 2 more examples. This is from the art world. Rodin's, this Balzac, this study for a dressing gown of Balzac. You can see a prominent something missing there. And a wonderful quote by Rilke, that for Rodin, the participation of air was always of tremendous importance. And so this, I think, sculpture was from 1897, which is right around the time when people start talking about the substance of air, of void, of space as something that's tangible. And then a later, so this may have been more influential to him in the curriculum early on, but then also this a later work, this Gabot piece, where you can start to see the kind of the transparency, these issues of transparency and the kind of diaphanous quality of it, and the sense of like being able to see through it, where you can't see through stone, you can see through plexiglass and string, so forth. So anyways, a new way of thinking about a sculpture as well. And in painting, in the 30s when Kylie was in school, there was the whole regionalism, the school of regionalism, where coming in the Depression, you had this situation where there's and after World War I, a lot of upheaval and contesting kind of schools of thought about painting and the European modernists and their influence, but also then a reaction to that as through regionalist painters like Grant Wood. And this is, well, I'll use this image again in combination with something from the Miller Garden. So yet another way of kind of getting at this idea of creative people, in this case a painter, kind of how they were during this period, kind of how the way that they were thinking about things progressed in a very, very legible way. Mondrian and not by accident, this idea of trees and its application to today's subject matter. Early on, around the turn of the century, this is the way Mondrian was painting trees. And think of the Midwest and the topography of the Midwest, and also then think of the Netherlands. Both are generally very flat, highly farmed, organized, controlled. They have to control things there to survive. And then, very quickly starting to get more and more abstract, but having the same subject matter. And then getting to the point finally, eventually, I love this portrait of him, some of his later paintings in the 20s. So again, this was stuff that was happening about a little bit before Kylie was there, but I think that de Stijl, whether it be, and I guess Kylie did talk about, now I'm drawing a blank on one of Mondrian's kind of colleagues in the de Stijl movement, but I think that when you look at this painting on the right especially, and then you see the plan of the Miller Garden, you'll see a certain affinity to that. And then even bursting out of the canvas and getting into three-dimensional space in this case. And then in this drawing here, again, to think of this and then be thinking about the kind of dynamic, active quality of an orthogonal arrangement and this is an unfolded elevation, so that's like the space flattened out. So eventually Kylie ended up, after leaving Boston, going to Washington, D.C., as I mentioned, through his connection with Eero Saarinen, who had been at the OSS, the Office for Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the CIA. Saarinen resigned his position and recommended Kylie to take his place. And in the end, Kylie ended up designing the space for the Nuremberg war trials. And it's quite interesting in that, and this is not something I discovered, this is everybody who kind of studies Kylie. This is kind of a moment in, kind of a widely understood moment in that he rearranged the courtroom, not in the way that we typically would have it with the judge at the front and it being symmetrical, but in fact turning so that all the accused are on the left and the judges on the right, and then all the press and audience is across this way. So it's an asymmetrical layout, and that again, if you think of the Miller Garden as you're going to see, is dominated by asymmetry. After he was doing, after he worked on the Nuremberg trial, he had, not the trial, but the courtroom, he had a chance to travel around Europe for the first time, and he saw a number of classic gardens, mostly in Germany, but some in France. He didn't see Vaux-le-Vicomte at that trip. He saw some other Le Notre projects, but I don't know if this is one of my most highly recommended projects for anybody to see if they're interested in landscape and gardening. Unbelievable, unbelievable. Much better than Versailles. And what's really amazing about it is as you move through it, it's Le Notre, the designer, very, very precisely manipulates the horizon line in such a way that as you're moving through it, there are things that the site appears to be one thing, but in fact, as you move through it, things are revealed. And so this is the view coming out of the house, the palace, and looking, and you see this fountain, and you see this wall here, and there's a statue in the distance, which is, I think, 2.5 times the size of normal scale. It's a Hercules statue, so it makes, in some ways, it brings that forward. But it looks like a pretty straightforward procession that you're going to be going on, but in fact, you come to a point about halfway through where there's this, and you really don't see it until really late. It's mind-blowing. And all of a sudden, there's this huge canal that's perpendicular to the axis that you've been walking on. And so all of a sudden, and then from that point on, you start to see, not the wall from here up, but in fact, that there's, a base to that wall. You would take a boat across that and then go up, if you wanted, to the top. Now, and it also works going backwards. So when you're up, this is taken right in front of the Hercules statue. So again, you don't see the canal. This canal is hidden again. The distance to the house looks much shorter. This pool looks square, but it's not. And then when you get down a little bit farther, you see again, now all of a sudden the palace is sitting on this low retaining wall, this highly articulated wall, and that again brings the palace forward. So it's an experience that is visceral, I'm telling you, of expansion and contraction, expansion and contraction. After that, he ended up working for a developer for a while on a project called the Holland Hills, which I've never been to. It's south of Washington, D.C., and he did, it's kind of a mid-century modern mecca. And the houses are all mid-century modern. It's pretty amazing. And there were 3 landscape architects who worked subsequently on the sites. The developer made each property owner buy a landscape plan for their house. And Kylie did about 100 of these. And he paid very little for them, so he had to do each one in a day, supposedly. Very few of them were built. But in any case, there were some things about these, and I'm not going to go into it, but there were some aspects of Kylie's work that start to emerge here, that you start to see a certain control, a certain geometry. Now, if you look at the canopies of the trees there, you see that the trees look somewhat natural in their placement, and that's anything but like the Kylie landscapes. He did do other projects that at Holland Hills that were in fact much more like tighter. So through his relationship with Saarinen earlier, Saarinen brought him on board for the competition team for the St. Louis Arch, and they ended up winning that competition. Alexander Girard was part of that competition as well, that team. That's at the awards ceremony. And so now we can get into the meat of the project again. The St. Louis Arch, if you go there now, it's been redone, the grounds have been redone. The actual realization of Kylie's original ideas, which were very, very powerful and seemed very promising, were undermined by people at the Parks Department. And so very, very little of it was realized. But it has been redone, done by a very, very good landscape architect, Michael Van Valkenburg, out of New York. But in any case, we can now kind of get into the Miller House. Well, I should say that, you know, you can imagine what winning a competition like that would do to your career. So all of a sudden, Kylie starts getting a lot of work, and a lot of it with really, really well-known architects. So for the Miller House specifically, again, if you remember the title of this talk, the idea was to, you know, not to approach modernism from the stance of what I think so many people do, think of it as being like just completely abstract and placeless, that it's cold, it's not of human scale, all the kind of things. These are the kind of things that Thomas Wolfe was harping on in his book. What I was trying to set out to do is just try to figure out connections that would and aspects of the Miller Garden that seemed Midwestern. Like what is it that makes the Miller House Garden a Midwestern project? And so that's what I'm going to try to do here tonight. And so this is a landscape aerial photograph. As you can see, I'm sure it's familiar to you, especially if you're from Indiana or Illinois or Ohio or farther west. But in the Midwest, it's generally very flat. Organized by the Jeffersonian grid, highly controlled. It's one of, mechanized, requires machines to plant and harvest. It's generally made of monocultures. And then all the kind of cultural memes that grow out of that kind of landscape, you know, that things should be in their place, things should be ordered. That, you know, they depend on hard work and bootstrap kind of ethic. You know, they're honest landscapes. You can see them. They're not hiding anything. I think that develops a certain kind of conservative approach to maybe a view of the world. And then just the vastness. I mean, the year I taught at University of Illinois, when you leave Champaign, it's unbelievable. Like it's like you're out in the middle of in the ocean. You know, the horizon is so it's infinitely far away. You can't figure it out. There's a scale of it is amazing, right? And so those are things that were there, that still are there, but I think were even more so there when Kylie ended up getting this commission for the Miller House. And it should be said that the house was started actually before Kylie. It was in construction when Kylie first went to the project, when he first did a site visit. Yeah, interesting juxtaposition here that I found. But again, it goes back to that school of that regionalist thinking evoked in a painting, but also J. Irwin and Xenia Miller. They're a real powerhouse couple. Xenia worked, I guess, very, very closely, especially with Girard, and there's a wonderful letter that she wrote to Miller when he was away at the war. He was in the Navy in World War II. about building a house. Like, could you imagine building a house that's very modern? I think she says very, very, very modern. And, you know, it's pretty interesting, the prescient kind of attitude that she would have. And you know, Jaron, I'm sure, quickly bought into that. Also interesting that she's holding the hard hat. In any case, so here are two coincident, or I should say contemporary spreads in magazines. The Miller House, one of the things that's quite interesting about it is that because of the Millers leading a very private life, hardly anyone knew about the project, and it wasn't, other than this House and Garden article in 1959, which didn't show anything of the landscape really. And the landscape was very raw at that point, very young, immature. And then that's a UK publication, House and Garden, but then I thought this was interesting, the Better Homes and Garden, which is a USA. This is a spread from the same month with this emphasis on traditional architecture. And, you know, again, rooms that are tightly defined, organized by corridors, you know, kind of a wild array of furniture. It's and then, you know, in fact even just the massing and with the shutters and so forth, and the farm fencing and so forth. Anyways, so very, very different takes on domesticity. There's also in the article, in the House and Garden article, they mentioned that the Miller House is actually quite Midwestern. That in a traditional Midwestern house, you have the rooms all opening up into some kind of common space, and that's what the Miller House does as well. We'll look in more detail in that plan. So here's the plan of the house as drawn, and also as one of the moments in one of the rugs that Alexander Girard designed. So it's essentially a diagram of the house with these colored spaces being the spaces that are walled in and that have more private functions, and then the yellow spaces, which are the more public spaces. And notice that it's in what we call a pinwheel design. It's not a cruciform, right? Each axis, each vector is kind of off-center from its neighbor, but it addresses all four directions, right? So it's very dynamic. And so and this is about as classical and traditional a layout for a house as you could ever imagine. It's called a 9-square grid, right? 16 points of structure. You'll see one in the next from the 16th century, but it's a bit unusual in the sense that it's not all. It's not a square grid, but it's a rectilinear grid, so that the middle bay is in fact longer or wider than the ones on the ends. So it does have a certain dynamic quality to it. Again, these masses that are in the corners, which are again matched by these, those are the private spaces. And then the public space is the dining room here, the living room, and this office space here. This is actually the children's kind of activity space here. All of those spaces have big views, panes of glass looking out to the landscape with there's like virtually no frame, so it almost looks invisible when the glass almost kind of disappears as you walk through. So this is the Villa Rotunda by Palladio. It's really one of those famous houses of all time. There's a traditional 9-square where it's bilaterally symmetrical. That's what it looks like. Up on a big plinth, asserting itself up on the plinth. And here is the Miller House, which of course is hyper-modern in the way that the structure was designed. Instead of having load-bearing walls, you have a point grid of columns, steel columns, that have these cruciform tops to them, and what that enables Saarinen to do is, in essence, you think of the column as usually supporting a beam, right? Trabeated system. And in this case, what you have is you have the column coming up and then actually holding multiple beams, and the beams are split. So that allows the ability to bring light down into the building. And so that runs throughout. That's those gray areas, those gray strips. And notice how you'll see actually it extends even beyond the wall of the house. So it's actually going outside. So it really kind of makes a series, it makes it what appears to be a series of discrete planes that are kind of floating in space above your head while providing a lot of light. And so that's the interior condition. This is near the entrance. And this is the exterior condition. Now this is pretty amazing. So there's this little reflecting pool. You're looking out of the living room out into the distant landscape, and there's this reflecting pool here. Notice these little spigots, I don't know what you call them, and water falls out of those into the reflecting pool. It's like a curtain of rain or something falling into the pool. This is a view then looking back into the living room and the famous conversation pit, and that was an idea of Gerard's. Gerard, I think, at his own house had one of these, and thought it was great. Of course, what it does is it gets rid of a lot of furniture in the room and makes the room more open. And you see a lot of views of this. They're always taken from standing height. And so when you look into the distant landscape, you see the big lawn that's to the west, and a woods beyond which is the Flat Rock River. But you never see any pictures of sitting. They don't let you do this, I don't think, when you go to the tour. But anyways, I was able, and this is not from that experience. This is from the website. It has one of those cameras that you can move your finger around and get 360-degree views of the house. This is as close as I could get to the view from sitting down, and you can see that, look at the expanse of lawn there compared to the way it is. And the way I remember it, and I do have pictures of this, I just couldn't find them. They're on like 35 millimeter slides in some box. But unfortunately, so when I sat in this, essentially that forest just came right down into the foreground. So it's very much, again, like the Lenotre idea, where all of a sudden your understanding of space is completely kind of uprooted. And that's a view, again, standing out on the terrace. Those aren't window mullions. That's actually just three pictures that are kind of put together. And again, what's really interesting is, I think, how flat this looks. There's actually about I used to know this, how many, maybe 20, 30 feet grade difference between this level and where this lawn is. And you're not seeing that at all. So it reads almost like it's continuous. In Gerard's contributions, again, I mentioned look at the riotous kind of colors and the range of places, origins of all this decoration that's in the house. It's really amazing. And again, in contrast to the kind of soberness, sobriety of the house. But he did these rugs. I showed you the one that had the diagram of the house, and it had a number of other icons that were, in essence, a narrative about the Miller family. This one is a rug that has pictures of the vegetation that's planted on the site. So it's surrounded by ivy, which there is a border of ivy that surrounds the house. And then leaves of the trees that are on the site. And it's really it's not a super diverse plant palette. It's, this isn't all the plants, but it's most of them, with the highlights of so honey locust, sycamore, willow, oak, horse chestnut, redbud, linden, maple, magnolia, and yellowwood. And most of these are native, not all of them. And it's interesting to think about, again, the culture of plants. Some plants have great stories behind them and have great, the oak. Lots of books have been written about the culture of oaks and the history of oaks. Same thing with the the elm, you know. But in any case, all these plants have different stories. They have very different qualities. You wouldn't think of redbud if you know redbud. It's considered to be a weed for the most part. And it's a great tree, but it's something that's really kind of come into vogue recently with the advent of people's interest in native plants. So Kylie was ahead of his time in using redbuds. So here's an outline of the site. It's 10 acres. I mean, one thing that's very deceptive about this is that you have to realize that there are a lot of neighbors over here that live in houses. So this is not sitting out on some distant estate, you know, protected. It's actually part of a neighborhood with relatively humble houses. It's quite interesting, I think, again, reflects well on the Millers that he actually wanted to live in town, as it were, and have neighbors and not be completely separated. But there's a continuous landscape, that floodplain. It's a floodplain for the river that's down here at the low point. And there's that very steep slope is here. I did look up I got some images from the time of construction. You can tell that there was very little vegetation on the site other than the vegetation that was growing naturally along the river. Very, very little. And there was a lot of farmland around, especially north. So this was kind of on the edge of town when they built it. So I've got a few diagrams here for you to kind of hopefully help you understand the site. You know, you can think of this as, I mean, when you look at this quickly, it's hard to know where the house is and where the landscape is, you know, where one starts and where the other does. So that's the house right there. Whoops, sorry. And, you know, highly orchestrated here, all orthogonal in terms of its geometry. That kind of linear geometry makes its way down the slope. There's a big stair here. And it used to be a triple row of sycamores. They've changed these out to, I think they're red maples now. And there's only, I think, a single row. And the idea was that eventually there would be this kind of wandering path through the landscape with a few nodes that would have sculpture in them. So it's one of these kind of, you know, engaged kind of organizations where one nests in the other, and leaving this kind of void, this big floodplain lawn in the middle that kind of mediates between the two. I mentioned the 9-square grid before. You can kind of draw what is almost like a 9-square grid on the site itself, but it's much more difficult to do. It's much more dynamic, and so I mentioned that there was a slight kind of manipulation of the traditional 9-square grid in the house. The landscape is much, much more active and dynamic. So here's a neat drawing that is showing, it's not moving. All right. That is kind of an interesting way of depicting landscape where they're just showing the trunks of the trees. You're not seeing the canopies. And so it's very legible here, more so than in the plan, where you can start to see the kind of nature of this kind of landscape versus the kind of nature of that kind of landscape. That's that big steep bank that you can start to see drawn. In terms of orthogonal planting, and remember, again, going back to the farm images that I showed, and also the Grant Wood painting, you know, I think one could think of these as orchards, small orchards. In fact, the apple orchards, which are here and here, those were actually planted with trees from a farm that the Millers owned. They've been recently, and they were fruiting apple trees, regular apple trees. They've now been replaced by crabs recently. A big entrance here. This is the main entrance for guests. There's also a service entry off of Washington, which is the main north-south street over here. So there are two entrances to the house, one that's more formal than the other. Now, in terms of boundary, this doesn't show up quite so well, but this is a real innovation that Kiley made. And again, remember, Miller, although he wanted to lead a private life, and he was building this major project that probably architects were going to come and hound, look through the windows like they would do at Cranbrook, as I understand. People would walk up to the booth house and look into the windows. In any case, there's a hedge that surrounds the house on 3 sides, and instead of it being, for instance, a wall or a fence, it's a staggered arborvitae hedge. So it used to be, when I first went to Columbus with my father, these were young enough and clipped enough that when you were driving by, you would get these oblique views into the site, so it wasn't completely opaque. And then through the years, as I would go back, they would grow in, and so you still read them as segmented, but they've grown, they were grown so densely that you really couldn't see those oblique views, or they were very, very minimal. Now, you'll see some images where they've replanted a lot of the sites, so it's kind of starting over again, which is pretty interesting. Kind of painful for someone like me who saw the project at its kind of most fullest, most mature state before it started to decline. So there, obliquely, you can, again, you're really up against this hedge, so you're seeing it as continuous from this angle, and this is Washington Street. I think all the hedges are 10 feet tall, I think is what the dimension is throughout. So this is the service entry. I mentioned the ceremonial entrance and the service entry. There's a greenhouse here. So the main entrance to the house, the ceremonial entrance to the house, is planted with these amazingly sculptural horse chestnuts and these pretty amazing taxus or yew hedges. I've always wondered how they prune these things so precisely. Anyways, and this has origins in some obscure French landscape architects in the 20s, landscape architecture in the 20s. But anyways, one of the things that's interesting, if you've ever been to Versailles or any big estate, oftentimes the house is at the end of the entrance, right? So you come in and you see the front door. In this case, like it's so by Lenotre, you're entering and the house isn't seen. So you come in and you're really immersed in landscape as you're coming in. This is looking back once you get close to the house and looking back. So you have these really strong horizontal planes of clipped yew, and then you have these very strong vertical walls of the arborvitae. The original plan was to have, Saarinen wanted to have a 25-foot terrace that extended out of the house. So this floor is, continuous into the house. The word is that Kiley convinced him that he should give up some of that for landscape. So it is still really a plinth, in that there is a curb that runs along here that contains and establishes kind of a small plinth that has ground cover in it. And so it's 10 feet here and 15 feet here, with about, I think it's 7.5 feet overhang. You can see here a lot of control here. Horizontal shrubs, horizontal, yews here, ivy that grows at a very consistent level, the lawn that's very consistent. Everything is very, very precise and kind of flat in its planarity. There's a segmented, like the hedges, there's a segmented wired glass partition that separates the kind of formal entrance from the service entrance. Which is unusual. Usually those things you try to somehow separate them more substantially, but here it's almost as though it's making a statement about them being somewhat equal, but in fact you need some kind of functional separation, so it's a translucent kind of boundary between the two. This is the entrance here. Again, not some grand giant door, saying I'm important and I'm wealthy. Here, what says they're wealthy is that's a Brock at the end of the view. I actually went to the house, was toured by, second time I went to the house, the Millers were still living there, and I was given a tour by Will Miller, the youngest son. And so the Millers still live there. They spent their summer, winters in Palm Beach. And so all the art was still in the house. Unbelievable, unbelievable. And all the rugs and everything was mind-blowing. Now when you go, it's still great, but it's hard for me to, like, I saw the house when it was being lived in, which was completely different than the way it is now. Anyways, that view again from standing at the kind of in the living room and looking out and seeing so much of that lawn. That's some indication of the views. That's the entrance. The East Garden here, I have a few images. Again, a fair amount of void space in here, a lot of empty space, and no flower beds, you know. And again, the interesting things, and I do have a picture, I think it's the last one that I have, that shows the kind of diaphanous quality of this landscape. Kylie talked a lot about, he used to take a walk in the woods every day when he was at home in Vermont. And he talked about how good landscape architecture should be like walking in the woods. And that there would be this, you know, always this changing, ever-changing kind of environment, but that you could walk in a very dynamic way through it in different ways at different times. And this really does have that kind of quality because it's essentially lawn and then trees. So you can walk underneath the trees. It doesn't have set pathways that you are directed to follow. So it does have that kind of quality, and you end up with these very interesting juxtapositions of, you know, boss in the foreground, and whether you're seeing these, or, you know, axially, or whether you're looking through them obliquely, they look completely different. This is the view looking from the house to the east. So at sunrise, as you can see. But again, that gives you the sense of quality of how you could really walk anywhere you wanted in here. Will Miller said that as kids they loved it. They thought it was really fantastic. Growing up here, they could make all kinds of, you know, imagine like Kylie's Kids with Strings. They could invent their own worlds out here. You also see those segmented hedges. Now these are the apple trees. So there's a bosque here and a bosque here. And again, here's an axial view where you kind of read the grid. And here is an oblique view through there where they almost look random. If you ever go to the 9/11 memorial, that's how that scheme is based. That's what that scheme is based on, essentially a line of trees where, when you're looking, actually you see these very strong lines of trees, but if you look obliquely through them, it looks like a forest. And another thing here, and this is someone, if you've ever been to the Edsel and Eleanor Ford estate, Jens Jensen used to do this quite a bit, and Olmsted did it as well, this idea of kind of planting a landscape in such a way that you had dark, shadow underneath the trees that would then frame a lit lawn in the middle. And this is, look how, that's a very legible rectangle. It's pretty amazing. Anyway, so that lends a pretty amazing quality to it, that contrast between shadow and light. There are these are where the red buds are on the north side that the dining hall looks out at. And again, red buds are, so here's a drawing that shows shows that pinwheel axial quality of the house, and then the dimension of the planting. Kylie planted trees very, very close together, which the gardener who took care of the house for over 30 years that I took my first tour of the house complained about and thought Kylie was crazy because it required so much pruning, and my thought was it kept you employed for 35 years. I don't know what you're complaining about. But also there is an ecological reasoning behind this too. Not that they knew of it at the time, but if you know about all the advances in understanding how trees communicate with one another through their root systems and connected in mycorrhizae, trees need to have proximity. That's why in the landscape, in just the wild landscape, you tend not to see trees by themselves out in the middle of fields, right? You tend to see them in groupings. That's because they work as communities. So this is something that in fact could have, you could argue that it has a kind of ecological soundness to it. So here's the quality of those red buds. Kind of wild if you know what red buds are like. They're not something that you buy that you know is going to have a certain perfect form with a central trunk and a perfect canopy that most people want to have. It's a bit wild, and that's the quality of red buds. And again, and yet they're planted on a grid, so with a gravel base. And so the shadow, again, you have to also think about, somebody should do a study of just photographing the shadow of the canopies of all the different trees here, because they all have, the shadow pattern of a white oak is very different than the shadow of a honey locust, or very different than a redbud, right? Now these were at some point later, the Millers, I don't know if they fired Kiley, but they hired some other landscape architect. And the landscape architect, and one thing is that redbuds aren't long-lived trees. And so as they grew old, this landscape architect planted these crabs in here, which I think are really awful compared to the redbuds. I mean, the redbuds have so much character. These are varieties that are like groomed, and they study the DNA of these things and get them to grow the same way, right? So it's much more kind of the same, and heavy, and the branching is so heavy. I think they've now replaced these and gone back to the redbuds. A little bit of flowers in there. Kiley talked about flowers they're wonderful, but he said they're like the fingernails of a body. They shouldn't be the most important thing. All right, and so the last thing is the famous LA that's on the west side, and it's anchored at one end. It was by Henry Moore sculpture at one end, and then Lipschitz on the other. And Gary Hildebrand, who is just a fantastic contemporary landscape architect who chairs the program at Harvard now and has written wrote a really fantastic book about the Kiley Garden. Talked about this not so much as an LA as we think of something moving toward an ending or an axial object at the end, but in fact it's really more could be thought of as a loggia, something to look out through when you're in the house, right? And it's on the west side, so it shades the house in the winter when the foliage is on the tree, and in the winter when the foliage drops from the honey locust, it lets the sun in. And there I thought these two images, kind of interesting formally, the way this painting is set up with this kind of perspectival, scene of a fall plowing by Grant Wood with the farmstead in the background. And the tool that's out front, which is fantastic. It's too bad there isn't a lawnmower here. But in any case, a lot of the art was sold off. So when you go there now, the Moore isn't there, the Lipschitz I don't think is there, and a lot of the art is either sold off or donated to the museum, or kept by the kids perhaps. Anyways, and this has been planted a number of times through the years. In the winter, they would take spruce boughs and use it as mulch, kind of on top of the ground cover. But again, you can see the different quality in winter than the earlier photographs of it at night. And then there's the artificial light, I think, coming kind of at late afternoon, whatever, even on the outside, emphasizing that strategy for the architecture. There is most of the views from the house. I'm going to finish up. most of the views, when you look out these big, the large rooms and the large views, you're looking at landscape, at spaces. Again, you're not looking, again, think of that way back into the 30s or even earlier when they were talking about how space becomes something of importance, not just something as an object. And so in the other views, when you're looking out, you don't see any, there's no focal point. In this case, there's a small fountain. I think it's a Roman fountain or something that they bought, like an actual Roman fountain. But I could be wrong about that. But anyways, there's a little fountain here in the background, and that's one of the, where the redbud hedges, the redbud bosks here and there. One is oriented north-south, one's east-west. But they frame this view. And what I find interesting is that there's this amazing dinner table that Saarinen designed. It's, I think, Saarinen? Yeah. And it's marble, I think, and it's about this thick, and it's lit underneath. It has built-in lighting on the other side. It has this basin in the middle, which water can flow into. And I don't know if you know of. There's a very kind of the most famous Renaissance garden in Italy is the Villa Lante, and it has a table with a long linear stone table, about as long as this room is wide, and it, with a channel in the middle of it, and water runs through it, and they would put their wine and fruit and stuff, things that they wanted to stay cold, they would put it in this linear basin. So in this case, this could have water in it. There's pictures of it with grass in it, and so they had all kinds of things that they could do, with this. But it's interesting. I always wanted to take a measurement of what that circle is and what that fountain is, because they're almost, and they seem about the same. So there's kind of interesting inside-outside connection there. The rug in the, again, another Girard rug in the dining room. This diagonal pattern is actually on both the gates that Girard did outside. One of them is just very, very minimal, and it's just steel bars of this diagonal grid. The other one is at the pool, which has a diagonal grid as a kind of a base or skeleton with much more ornamental ironwork in addition, a little bit like kind of the way this is reading. But in any case, again, so that's an interesting, another inside-outside kind of connection that was made, that in terms of a pattern of a rug and then what these gates are, how the gates are designed outside. And another kind of story that wasn't much known about this for a long time, but it's kind of started to creep out after a while. The original planting is, I mentioned that Warren Manning was such a great plantsman and Kylie apprenticed under him. Well, most of the original planting failed on this project, and there's really heavy clay soils in here, and there wasn't adequate drainage for the trees and shrubs, so they almost had to replant the entire site. But some of the honey locusts that were part of the original alley that had survived and were healthy, they replanted them in a different location. So these honey locusts here and there, you're seeing the foliage from the horse chestnuts, which are behind us, by the way. So those trees are actually things that kind of, again, the project kind of accepted, and Kylie accepted this kind of, need to be kind of nimble for the project, that it wasn't fixed, that they could kind of accept kind of change like that. And that kind of, you think about this, I've been talking about the project as being kind of airtight or whatever, so regimented and so forth. These trees, and there aren't a lot of them, but they do a lot of work in terms of the aesthetic experience of the place. It's not just all orthogonal, and these trees take on really wonderful contrapuntal kind of roles in the landscape. And I think this is the last image that I wanted to show. I talked about the kind of the quality of this landscape that one could, because of the trees and by the way, the way that they're pruned. So they prune them up high so that you can move through them. It has this amazing kind of varied degrees of density, and it depends at what level you're kind of looking at them from. And here from above, I think you can kind of sense the kind of, I wrote diaphanous at the bottom here. You know, this idea, I mean, it's that quality of the, and this is of course in winter when the foliage is not there, or I guess there's some flowering here, so it's spring, you know, and the foliage hasn't come out. Anyways, this kind of incredible quality of the trees as objects, and then the shadows that they're projecting on to the ground. So I think I'm going to stop there. Anyways, thank you. Thanks for your patience. I'm sorry to talk so long, but welcome to feel any questions. And by the way, on the, you know, we've been looking at that roof from underneath all the time, right? So here you can see the gabled skylight structures on the house. So, people have questions? Jeff, I think there's.
L.A., could you explain, I'm not clear about what the term.
LA. Oh, LA.
Yeah, could you explain really what that means? Because I'm not aware.
Well, and it's related to the word alley, I suppose. But the idea is that it's generally a tree-lined, like, I mean, and it's something that usually would have some kind of focal point at the end, right? Not always, as the case is here, but I mean, here they have the sculptures, but again, in some ways, the more important aspect of it is how you look perpendicular through it versus along its length. It works both ways. So the LA is something that's kind of one of those quintessential ingredients of formal landscapes.
Can you spell that, please?
A-L-L-E-E with an accent over the, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. How did Miller make his money? So I'm glad you asked that question. One of the many things I didn't mention, but if I did, we'd be here for 3 hours. So he was born into the family that didn't start, but ran the Cummins Engine Corporation. So diesel engines. It's a Fortune 500 company. They don't make just diesel engines. They also, you know, it's like any Fortune 500 company has all kinds of, it's a conglomerate of all kinds of things. They made generators, like portable generators for a while. They've sold that off now. And they've diversified their services having to do with diesel engines and things related, like brake systems or maybe fluid filters and things like that. So when you're on the highway, you know, when semis go by, you'll sometimes see the Cummins engine logo on the side of the truck. So his maternal grandfather was, I think, was started by a man named Cummins, and then his maternal grandfather took over the company, and then he then took it over. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He went to Yale, played a Stradivarius.
He was talking about what Miller did for architecture in Columbus.
Yeah, the Miller, again, through this friendship that he forged with Saarinen early on, started to see architecture as a way of making his town, putting his town on the map, essentially. And in some ways, it, of course, was important if he wanted to have a great company and he needed really gifted employees and smart people, who's going to want to move to Columbus, Indiana. So it certainly, there were a number of different ideas behind that. But I think just in general, I mean, he was really an amazing guy. I mean, as much as he was, you know, a gray-suited, flannel-suited, you know, conservative guy, he also was heavily involved in church and the United church, I'm not sure what organization it is, and he was very involved in the civil rights movement. Like he paid the bail for a lot of civil rights protesters in the South. He got them out of jail essentially. So he had this really interesting aspect of understanding justice and so forth as well. Kind of a good Republican. They used to exist. We're in Ann Arbor, so I can say that and not get shot. I think this gentleman in the back, oh, sorry. He's been.
Oh, no, I just had a question. His family was banking also.
Banking, yes.
Urban side.
Yeah, so they had a bank, let's see, so, I'm just trying to think, it was from, maybe, no. Was it from the wife's side, the bank? It was called the Union,
His mother's side.
yeah, the mother's,
His mother's side is the Irwins, and they were
Yeah.
banking.
yeah. And the bank unfortunately went belly up during the recession. And so it doesn't exist anymore. They've turned, I think it's the very first building that Saarinen did in Columbus was a branch bank. It's downtown. It's now used as a community center or something like that. Anyways, and originally it was bounded, it was on a corner, it was bounded by older buildings, which then they took away some of those buildings. They built a big addition to that, but they also made this amazing drive-through, and Kylie did it. And it was this, you go to drive-throughs to deposit checks, whatever, and it's a whole other experience. This one, you drove through essentially an orchard of honey locust trees, incredibly beautiful. And there were no bollards needed or anything, because the trees essentially, and the pits of the trees, like told you where to go. I mean, it had such logic, and it was almost like a little park. Really wonderful.
Peter.
I was pointing because they were gonna. You'll be able to hear her.
Appreciate.
No microphone needed.
I appreciate the ending of your show, because it's metaphoric on so many levels, because I love the density of your talk, but I didn't get mired into it. It was like, wow, stories and layers. So we learned about history, but for me, the real thrilling part was the way you related disciplines, and painting and architecture and landscape architecture and their interconnection. So I love that we ended there with the diaphanous relationship that you illuminated for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Just a little bit, there are a number of art historians in the audience, so it's like, oh boy. Do the best I can. Anyways, speaking of art historians, okay.
Thank you, Peter. That was beautiful. It's so structured. Can people hear me with the mask on? Yes. Yeah. Thinking of this in a Midwest context is really interesting, but it got me thinking about a terrific little book called Midwest Futures by Phil Christman, who teaches in the writing program at the U. Has anyone read that? It's a little book, but it's a deep, deep history of the Midwest, and how people think about land is important. And a reference you made to the Jeffersonian grid is important. And I'm wondering if it gives us a way to think about the lawn here, because a big point in that book is that people in the US were always trying to put the land to use. They were thinking about the future, how it could yield economically as they displaced Native people and so on. And you mentioned that the area around here had been farmland, right? But here we've got this big lawn, and it's not empty. I mean, you told us that. But does it say something that it's not being put to use in that way? And what does that get you thinking about?
Well, okay, so one of the things that John had wanted me to touch on was this idea of, what's the, maybe, I don't know if this is so accurate, John, but what I took from it is, if you were to be given a project like this today, how would you design it, And I have to say that when you think about architecture, architecture has been, and Hildebrand writes about this idea of, since it's so dependent on technical issues and mechanical issues and so forth, advances structurally, like going from load-bearing structure to steel frame and stuff, creates these monumental changes in architecture. And then you have people being very polemic about what those changes represent. And people with great convictions about, new horizons and so forth. Landscape architecture for a long time, and this is the case when Kylie went to Harvard, I didn't really say this specifically, but they were really mired in the Beaux-Arts. I mean, Gropius was there doing all this amazing stuff, and Gideon, whatever, space-time and architecture. So it's this new world of architecture that the students were all very excited about. Landscape architecture was still mired in like the Renaissance. And there was some, I guess, a comment one of the professors made to Kylie or Ekbo or Rose, or maybe all three of them, who said something about trees aren't made in factories, therefore we don't really have to worry about a modern landscape architecture. And so anyways, but I would say that landscape has really taken a seat at the foreground of design thinking, because so much of it is based on new advances in ecology and issues of urbanity that are really, and climate change, of course. So it's landscapes, you don't design landscapes like this anymore. You don't design landscapes with big lawns like this anymore so much. So, and yet, I think this project deserves it to be preserved the way that it is. I mean, but if you were to, there are lots of things that you can do instead of a mowed Kentucky bluegrass lawn, right? I mean, there's no-mow, there are meadows, there are all kinds of things, but it wouldn't have the same aesthetic. You couldn't, if you put a meadow in here, I don't think it would have the same kind of effect. Now, it'd be great if that whole valley or that whole floodplain, maybe if that was farmed and the Millers were out there drinking their cocktails and a combine went by, through their property, that'd be pretty cool. They probably wouldn't like it, but that's a kind of a fun image. So, yeah, I think that the lawn is, again, is a thing in many ways of the past, as are all kinds of like formal devices that landscape architecture was for centuries kind of mired in. And so with new issues, as I mentioned, new knowledge of ecology, but also new ways of fabricating things, through computers and printing and all kinds of things. The geometry of projects. A project that you might be interested in going to see is the new Gerstacker Common out on the North Campus. It used to be just lawn and trees. And now a very well-known landscape architect, Chris Reed of Stoss, which is a firm based in Cambridge, they redid the project, and it's very much shaped by stormwater management issues, because there's a lot of stormwater that's coming off all those buildings, and all that water has got to get to the river somehow. And so they've developed a series of kind of mounds. They balance the cut and fill of the mounds, and then recesses or depressions as places where water can infiltrate and get into the water table before it goes, has a chance to soak into the ground before moving on. So that is and the geometry of the topography is mirrored by these, CNC routed, or cast continuous benches that are both walls and benches, So it's a very interesting project. It's a project that's very young, so it's, I think you need to give it some time for the vegetation to grow in. But I don't know what Melissa thinks. She teaches out on the North Campus. I don't know if you've heard anything about how it's been received. I think it's a very nice project. So yeah, the landscape architecture really has changed a lot since this. I don't think there's anybody who would. But trees on grids are still great. I think. And there are some landscape architects, if you're interested. There's a guy named Shane Cohen, whose office is in Minneapolis. He's excellent, C-O-E-N, Shane Cohen. His work, like when I was trying to think of what landscape architects who are practicing now kind of embodies somehow the spirit of what I would say is an authentic spirit in the sense that it's contemporary. It's not just mimicking, aping. Kylie, he does a lot of very minimalist landscapes, but with really interesting materials like indigenous stone and so forth. And his work is fantastic, very good. Yeah, Peter Walker, who did the 9/11 memorial.
Is the Irwin House open in the winter?
You know, I don't know if anyone who's been there just recently, I don't know if they give tours in the winter or not. Yeah, I would think they'd probably want to keep it going year-round, but yeah. Yeah, it's worth seeing for sure. And then there's so much other. Kylie did a lot of work in Columbus, a lot of work. I mean, he did all of Serna's work, Harry Weiss. There are a lot of schools that were done, you know, under this program. I didn't mention that Miller started a foundation that paid the architects' fees for any public building, as long as they selected architects from a list. And so, you know, the people who were able to get those school jobs, the post office, whatever, they were, you know, very high-ranking architects of the era. And yeah, so Kylie did all that work. I mean, essentially, he did. Sasaki, another prominent firm, did a little bit of it, but 90% of it is Kylie. So thank you for coming. And I can stick around if you have additional questions. I'm happy to stay for a bit.